resources, and I'll send you a chat reminder if you haven't, but feel free to also chat with me if you're having any technical difficulties and want the phone number to call in, or if you have any other questions from a technical side while things are going on. Other than that, over to you, Pedro.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you, Reina, and welcome to the January Forum of Fair Coalition and the Fair for All campaign. We have a couple speakers. We have Mithili, who is in New York, and Jayati, which I see, she's also online. And they will speak later, and you guys can introduce yourselves once it's your turn. But I'm gonna get started with the presentation because we have a lot of material to cover. This conference, COP21 really has a lot of meat, and I'd like to go into all the details because I think it's really important for us to know what's really going on. So I'm gonna start the presentation. Okay, and I'm gonna share screen. Let me know, can you see?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, so this is a presentation of COP21, which I'm sure you guys know was a conference in this past December. So what is COP? A lot of people don't know what COP is, and what it stands for is Conference of Parties. And oops, we're just doing something weird. This is a conference where different parties, meaning different countries, met up to adopt an agreement. And this is the Paris Agreement. And this Paris Agreement represents a massive breakthrough in the fight against climate change. And there was a triumph, and the triumph was that the countries actually did meet, and that there was an actual agreement. So a lot of people say, well, there's still a lot to be done, but honestly, this was a really big triumph because to get all these countries together in one place is a big task, and it got accomplished. So, one sec. So some history previous to COP21, this whole climate talks and international climate diplomacy got started in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, which is where the United Nations Framework for Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, got started. And in this conference, they explained the dangers of climate change, but not many actions were taken. It was just more like, okay, this is climate change, it affects all of us, this is a global issue, and we all need to pay attention, but they weren't very specific on what each country needed to do. You guys can do more research on this conference because it also has a lot of meat, and it's very interesting. Then 1997, it was the Kyoto Protocol, which people, or all these countries, met again and towards the same goal to reduce emissions, a 5% reduction worldwide compared to 1990 levels by 2012. That was the goal. Unfortunately, it wasn't as successful as it should have been. This document really is a very well-written document, and it had a lot of potential, but it wasn't as successful because countries didn't ratify it on time. So what happened is developing countries, including China, South Korea, Mexico, and other rapidly emerging economies, were not given targets, and they were not allotted to increase their emissions at will. And also what happened is that the US did not ratify it because it couldn't get it past Congress. The reason why they weren't able to do that is because Congress said that unless 55% of global emissions ratify it, the US wasn't gonna do it. And Russia ended up ratifying it as a part of a move to apply themselves to the World Trade Organization membership with the European Union. And when Russia ratified it, then they had enough weight to get the US to ratify it. But by that time, it was way too late. And it's really sad because it was a great document. You know, it had its flaws, but it failed, sadly. And this is why the conversation is still going. In 2007, nations agreed in Bali after much drama that an action plan was needed to sign a new agreement to take over Kyoto because, again, it was a complete failure. And then in 2009, they had the Copenhagen conference in which countries met again. And as I was talking to Mithili, it was chaos. But some things got accomplished. All the world's developed countries and the biggest developing countries agreed for the first time to limit on their greenhouse gas emissions. However, there was no fully articulated and legal binding treaty, and the emission reductions agreed on were not enough to meet scientific advice. And it was not fully adopted by the UN because of the last minute chaos that I was just talking to you guys about. So that's the past. That's what's been talked about in the past, and now we're up to the Paris meeting. But then the Paris meeting happened because 6 different questions or issues have long been central to diplomacy, and they were never answered. And that's what Paris tried to accomplish. So the first, Reina, sorry, real quick. Reina, are you there?
Yep, sorry, I'm here.
How do I get rid of the screen with all the people? Because it's covering my text.
You can physically drag it. So if you click on it and just sort of move it around, you should
I got it.
away. Got it?
I got it. Yeah, it had like a little bar. Okay, cool. I got it. Okay, now I can see it because I had to keep moving it.
Oh,
All
okay.
right.
Yes. Oh, yes. There's also a bar where you can minimize it.
So much better. So much better. So yeah, so one of the issues that the Paris meeting tried to address was the temperature limit. As I mentioned, the Copenhagen meetings did not really satisfy the scientific advice, and that's what Paris tried to do. So the explicit goal that they had was to keep the global temperatures well below 2 degrees by 2100. The thing is, a lot of countries, especially island countries, were like 2 degrees Celsius is not enough, because with 2 degrees Celsius, we're gonna be completely flooded. So they pushed for 1.5 degrees by 2100. And that was still recognized in the Paris Agreement because, it is 2 degrees Celsius is better than 4 degrees Celsius, but it's still not good enough. Some countries thought that it was too ambitious, but more than 100 countries agreed, even the US and China. And like I said, many island states did not accept more than 1.5 Celsius. The agreement directed in the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is asked voluntarily to draw up a report by 2018 on how to reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius. So it wasn't agreed on during the Paris Agreement, but they are going to provide a how-to guide to, not flood these island states. So where in the agreement this is specified is in Article 2, Section 1, where it says, this agreement enhances the implementation of the convention, including its objectives, aims to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty, including by holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 Celsius, so to well below, meaning 2. A lot of countries just aim for 2, above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 above pre-industrial levels, recognizing that this would significantly reduce the risk and impacts of climate change. I don't know if you guys have seen this graph, but these are the temperature increases according to different scenarios. There is the worst case scenario, which is 4-degree change by 2100, and the best case scenario, which is 1.5. So, everybody shoots for the 1.5, but only 2 got approved. So how's that going to happen? Obviously, by abandoning fossil fuels, because we all know fossil fuels, when they are combusted, they emit greenhouse gases. So how quickly will the world abandon fossil fuels? Long-term decarbonization ambition is that they say net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And I will explain what net zero emission means, because they really had a big fight between zero carbon emissions and net zero. And this is said in Article 4, Section 1 of the agreement. I'm not going to read what the actual agreement says. If you guys would like to go, I mean, it's in the PowerPoint. If you'd like for me to read it, you can also let me know, but I think it won't be necessary. Island states wanted forceful language calling for draft phrases like zero global emissions by 2060, but it said net zero goal. And what this means is that zero global emissions mean complete zero emissions from anywhere, any car, any factory, anything. But they said, and this was pushed by a lot of countries like Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, which they have a large part of the economy is oil. They were pushing for the net zero wording on the agreement just because they don't think it is realistic to say zero emissions by 2060. And also they want to invest in technologies that can sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and somehow get rid of it. And that way, basically reduce the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Does that make sense? So for example, some technologies could absorb it and store it in the ground, just like oceans and plants. They also do the same thing naturally. So they wanted to invest in those technologies. And this is explained in Article 5, Section 1. But again, that's what was approved in the agreement. So the finance section, this is a really, really big part. The economics of COP21 was, I think, the most important part of the whole deal, is that who is going to pay for the cost of climate change and how much should we give? And during the Copenhagen talk in 2009, Hillary Clinton and the Secretary of State pledged that the rich world would mobilize, not donate, but mobilize 100 billion to help developing countries make their economies more sustainable and prepare for the storms to come, meaning floods, drought, not just literal storms, all the consequences that climate change would cause. In 2009 in Copenhagen, this number is supposed to be provided by 2020, but obviously we're in 2016 and this full amount still hasn't been reached. Like I said, mobilize is different than traditional foreign aid or donation. It's a money flow from several sources, including the private sector and not just government. So this is not going to be just from government funds. This is going to be from a holistic, from donations perspective. So when I said the rich world, it includes the US, the European Union, Canada, and Japan. And you might think, what about China and India? They have, there's very wealthy people there as well. But the US, the US really wanted to include them, but they really weren't a fan of donating them, mainly because they have a really large portion of their country that is still underdeveloped, and they really have to take care of internal issues related to climate change. The agreement also calls upon developing countries to make their own climate finance pledges if they're able to do so on a voluntary basis. This Mithili, the speaker that's going to speak right after this slide, is going to go deeper into this, but the Paris Agreement actually is divided in two different sections. The Paris Agreement, which is legally binding, which is still not legally binding, sorry, that's a typo, and the Paris Decision, which passes the agreement and sets out a number of less legally binding ways to approach it and observe it. The Paris Agreement includes no new specific commitments to the finance, but item 115 of the Paris Decision says so, which is what I said about Copenhagen. Okay, so Mithili, if you would like to take over on finance, you can go ahead and do so.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see my slides since I had to do this on my phone. But
I can bring them up. Let me just.
Yeah. I can't seem to get it to work on my laptop for some reason.
I apologize. You're gonna have to tell me when to switch and when not to
Oh
switch.
yeah. So the first slide is just explain. The big question here is like, what is climate finance really? And I don't know. It might shock some people to understand that it actually hasn't been defined at all. There, well, I'll wait till you get to the slide. So.
Okay, hang on. I'm looking through it. Let me download it. Sorry, I haven't downloaded it.
Oh, no, it's okay.
All right, it's opening, and can you see it? Is it no? Stop share screen. 1 second.
Yeah.
Okay, can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So just let me know when you like.
Yeah. So what I was saying before, it's the 100 billion that was supposed to be mobilized in that they announced in Copenhagen. They're still working on it. I think the OECD has said about 62 billion has been reached, but even that figure is controversial because they're counting private sector, they're counting loans, and what developing countries are saying is that no, it should all be public funding and it should all be grant-based, because the whole point of this is to get developed countries, like the richer countries, to pay to accept their historical responsibility for all these carbon emissions and climate disasters that have been happening. So that's really the big ask in this whole thing, is like, for countries to really fundamentally change the way their economies are growing and operating. Right now they're very fossil fuel heavy, and you're asking countries to change everything essentially and go operate on renewable energy. But obviously that can't happen overnight. And so that's where this fight comes in, because at first renewables are kind of expensive to switch to, but in the longer run they're cheaper, and I'll get into that a little bit more. But the bigger problem is that they haven't even figured out actually what climate finance is. And it's not in the text, and it's not in the agreement. And so there's like this big debate. And so developing countries don't want climate finance, the 100 billion plus whatever else money comes in from the UN and all these like 23 different funds that they have going. They don't want it to be confused with traditional aid and development funding. And so it's the big elephant in the room a lot. No one really wants to talk about it because it's this huge discussion and it gets very political. But it has to happen at some point, and I think it might happen starting in Morocco in December.
So,
oh yeah, go ahead.
I have a question regarding this. So the binding, so the decision, which is the other part of the agreement,
Mm-hmm.
that is not legally binding, which means they're not forced to pay. They're just paying if they want to pay, but they don't have to, right?
Yeah, the decisions are never legally binding. They change from year to year from each COP, and it's basically what they've decided that year. But it's you can't. The U.S. really fights people on this point in particular. They don't want a number to be legally binding. And there are positive points to that as well, because that number isn't necessarily accurate. We said 100 billion back in 2009, but if you're counting for inflation and ongoing disasters, that number is actually in the trillions, which is what it's going to cost countries to adapt to the climate that's already changing, and then account for reduced emissions and scaling up renewable energy. So it's good and bad that number is not legally binding, I would say. And I'm taking a very neutral stance on this. I'm sure there are people with strong opinions about it. But just the overview, that's what the issue is. And, this whole question of development aid versus climate benefit projects in developing countries, there are some clear-cut ones. Like they had these floods recently in South India. So a project to sort of mitigate the effects of flooding, like infrastructure development, that's a climate benefit project. And so that climate finance money would go towards that. And that's a pretty clear cut distinction. Where you get into the issue, this gray area, is when you have projects like getting more youth involved in agriculture in Africa. Yeah, because this is all really tied to agriculture. It is youth development. It can be seen as women's development, but it has this very, almost indirect effect on climate change as well. If you're getting people out of urban areas, you're reducing population density, you're reducing pollution, and you're getting more arable land used for what it was meant to be used instead of factories and manufacturing plants and stuff like that. So there's this gray area, and developed countries want to double count that money sometimes, and that's where this whole finance thing gets a lot more complicated than it actually seems. But that's just one example of an argument that has to take place at some point openly, rather than just in news articles and studies from universities, which I think it will. It's going to take some time to get to that point. And the other problem is, do you count private sector funding towards this 100 billion? Because, that always comes with conditions. Like if a company opens an office in Namibia and they want, they're obviously expecting a profit from it. And so these emerging markets aren't necessarily going to yield profits right away. But ultimately, does that company have a positive climate benefit for Namibia? Maybe, depending on what they're doing, sure. So there's, it just depends on what country counts that as climate finance. So the country where the company's coming from, or where the profits are going. It's, it's sort of that's another huge gray area, basically. And I wish I had a better answer for all of this, but that's kind of where it stands at this point.
And I think it's important also too, how do you determine whether a damage is caused by climate change or just like a regular storm? Like, we do have crazy storms here and there. We do have, but how do you determine, that's $100 billion? How do you determine that that's going to go towards that fund? Because I'm sure there's going to be so much, legal constrictions.
Yeah, and that's that's kind of determined by the fund that is allocating that money. So and obviously, like, developing countries are going to say a lot of things are climate caused because they need the money, they need the infrastructure development and all this positive impact. But who is it really up to say what was caused by climate and what is just bad governance?
Is there climate lawyers?
There are legal
does
people.
the UN have climate?
They do. Like UNFCCC does have legal personnel in some capacity. It's just, how do you use them? And then each country is going to have their own legal framework as well. Mm-hmm. So it's really, that's why there's this gray area between development projects versus climate benefit projects. And I think we're going to have to see like a lot of overlap in that, because they never ask for a legal claim on development projects. It's pretty obvious, like, okay, you need this money to, help women's development in your country. Like there's not that huge legal question. So I think it's probably going to end up something like that, and it'll be very subjective and very country based. So in the Philippines, there have been a lot of there's been a lot of damage because of the typhoons, and it's pretty obvious that that's what's caused it. And the IPCC, like you were saying, has determined that the typhoon was caused by climate change. So I think they'll base it a lot off of the IPCC reports. And it is an interesting legal question, I think, and how they're going to, the accounting of it will be very intricate, I think, and then kind of complicated. But
I can see how it's in a decision and not in the actual agreement, because if it's in the agreement, then it's legally binding, and this is really complex. Like I cannot imagine saying, okay, this money goes to this. Yes, this storm happened, so you're gonna pay this country this much money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's a lot of that will actually fall under loss and damage, which I think you're going to talk about in a little while. And the loss and damage is something that the least developed countries were really, really pushing for. And they push for it every year. And they had a provision that came into play in the Warsaw Decision, which was, I think, 2013. And so that was a pretty big deal for them to have that included. And it's important that that is included because now you have climate refugees. And who bears the cost of that? It can't just be the UN. It has to be some combination of funding and from the countries where they're coming from and the countries where they end up. And so there are a lot of issues with that as well. And that is a whole entire other issue, which I could probably talk about for hours. But for right now, this is what the basics are. And so yeah, it's all moving parts, I think. But one of the bigger things in Paris was, okay, you want this 100 billion, but it's not just 100 billion. It's 100 billion every year after 2020 that needs to be mobilized. So, and you can't just stop at infrastructure improvement for one year because it's constantly going to have to be improved because the climate is constantly changing. So the big fight now is like, okay, well, we're at whatever it is, 62 billion a year. But you have to scale up this pre-2020 financing. So if you see that term, that's what they mean, to get it all set before 2020. So part of this thing that you were mentioning is the 2018 review. I think they'll have like a finance review at that point as well. They kind of have to in order to see where they're going.
Yeah, so speaking of 2018,
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about that later. Yeah, I'm talking about when I talk about mechanisms, stock taking and ratcheting.
Yeah.
So okay, we'll discuss that later.
Okay.
It's a lot. It really is a lot.
Yeah.
Let me know when you want to change the slide also.
Yeah, let's go to the next slide. We can talk about. So since we're talking about health and the Global Health Forum and all that, I decided to put this in here. There are like 4 main areas that, besides the actual financing within the Paris Agreement, having signed it and having all those countries come together is significant in the sense that it mobilizes all kinds of other financial impacts. The ripple effects are going to be pretty huge, I think. And in particular in health, I think you'll see a lot more research linking the effects of climate on public health issues. So, and it's a lot of it seems to be tied to agriculture in one way, shape, or form. So I know the WHO had come out with a study a couple of years ago. I think it actually might have been 2013 at this point. They were saying that there's a higher incidence of diabetes in Pacific Island nations because of they've moved away from agriculture, or they've moved to like this monocrop kind of thing. I'm sure there are people who have a better agriculture background than I do, but they were saying that a lot of these Pacific Islanders have higher incidence of diabetes because they're eating more processed food and they're eating more imported food, which is not their traditional diet, because it may be cheaper, or it's just the fact that it's available and they want it. So I think this will have a lot of public health costs for those countries, and we may see some projects funded in order to get people back to traditional diets. This is definitely going to have an impact on food manufacturing companies. I mean, we already see it, like Whole Foods and all these other organic stores. Like, they're spending a lot of marketing money on getting back to these simple ingredients and these slow food movements and eating clean and all of that. I mean, these are all kinds of side effects of this focus on climate change, I think. What else is there? Oh yeah, so air pollution, obviously this is your specialty, so you can speak on it a little bit better. But I remember interviewing a guy called Richard Fuller last year, who's with this organization called Pure Earth. And he had these like staggering numbers about the number of deaths due to various air pollution aspects. I think it was like sanitation, urban air pollution, and then cook stoves, which is another huge ordeal. If you don't know, cook stoves are like these indoor cooking stoves that are usually implement like coal or wood burning,
Mhm.
but again, it's related to agriculture. Like people are moving away from rural areas into urban populations, so the density and then the air pollution affects them because of like vehicles and lack of public transport. And then there's also these cook stoves that are not, they're manufactured for cheap usually because they have to be,
Mhm.
because of the people who actually need them, who need to buy them. But I think you'll see a lot of money towards making those more energy efficient and healthier for
Yeah.
people. There was a summit last year here in New York about that, and there's an entire organization that is working on it through the
Oh, Mithili.
that are harming people. It's actually the particles released with carbon emissions from all these manufacturing plants and vehicles that are really harmful to people's health. I mean, we see it in Beijing, we see it in Delhi. People are having like higher incidences of asthma, and so all these things combine to like cost cities more for public transport. It costs companies more to put filters on their plants. And car manufacturers, you'll see them spending a lot of money to make their cars more fuel efficient, but also maybe running on renewables or cleaner energy somehow. So there's a lot of financial impact in those industries from
Right.
climate change. And it's not like a direct link, but it is there, and I think you'll see more of it in about 5 years.
Yeah,
But
and
even now, people are
as you were
starting to see it.
saying, there's a big correlation, and not just about air pollution, how it affects health, but happens that cars and factories, when they emit greenhouse gases, they also emit toxic chemicals and toxic compounds, particles, and so by
Yeah.
reducing the emissions, by investing in green energy, you're reducing both the health effects, the negative health effects, and the climate implications. So I think
Yeah.
it's good that people are pushing towards that.
Yeah. And the last point, I mean, I included conflict in this health slide, and it's not necessarily seen as a public health issue, but obviously, um, it results in loss of lives. So I figured it was relevant. But there is this growing body of research from universities, and I think there's a particular researcher at Berkeley and one at Columbia that are doing a lot of work on this. They are linking climate change with conflict, incidences of conflict. And there's a theory, which I'm not sure how substantiated it is quite yet, because they're still gathering data because it's a relatively new field of research.
Mhm.
But they were saying like the price of wheat is really what triggered the Arab Spring. People were unable to feed their families because the price of wheat had gone up so much, and it's such a staple in their diet that, and it was because of droughts, and it was because of land being used for other purposes rather than wheat production,
Mhm.
that it caused this whole ripple effect socially and politically. And it was really all because of one agricultural product that just happened to be so important to people. And, when you can't feed your family, it has all these other effects. So, I mean, I'm not, and I don't want to quote anybody on it because it's still sort of being researched, and studies are still coming out about it. But I think you'll see a lot more money towards that kind of thing as well, given the fact that it's still continuing and it hasn't mitigated at all. So,
Absolutely. It
um, sorry, go ahead. What were you saying?
Oh no, that it is a big player in conflict. I'm actually doing a lot of research on this too, uh,
Okay.
because I'm very interested just on how air pollution and also climate, because air pollution affects climate,
Hmm. Yeah.
affects conflict, and yeah, you do see a lot of correlation.
Hmm.
Very cool.
And another, I can speak to Asia a little bit, but like rice production, it's
Mhm.
getting more like automated and it's, you know, but with people moving into these urban areas more and more, it's getting more expensive. And so this obviously has an effect on pollution and socioeconomic impact and health impact. And so, you know, you see a lot of these ripple effects in health because of the environment. And we've moved so far away from that, I think, because we're so sterilized, especially in the States. But it has a much more immediate impact in the developing world.
Big time, big time.
So yeah, and especially like South America and Asia, I think it's much more immediate, even in cities.
Yeah, or even here in cities in the US, you notice too that people that live in poorer areas are usually more susceptible to flooding and to be more affected by the implications of climate change than those
Oh
that
yeah,
tend to live on the hills and mansions, and
yeah,
rich people usually don't really care.
yeah.
You know, so it's
Well, and
very,
there's this whole movement that like natural food should not cost more than prepackaged
yeah,
processed,
yeah,
but
that's
for some reason it does. And hopefully we'll see that change as a result of this focus after Paris. Like it seems like everybody is talking about climate change now, so maybe we'll see an impact there.
very good. Do you want me to change slide?
Yeah, let's go to the next one. So I think renewable energy is the field that will have the biggest financial impact after Paris. There was this energy summit that took place in Abu Dhabi last week, I think it was, or yeah, last week. And it was interesting. I mean, you would think in the Middle East, why would you have a renewable energy summit? But it makes perfect sense when you think about it. You know, right after Paris, the Gulf countries didn't really, you know, you're taking away the one way they make money. And like I was saying before, the big issue with the Paris Agreement is that you're asking countries to change the way their economies grow and the way their economies operate. And so this was sort of held in a place like Abu Dhabi to show these countries like, hey, you are in a desert. You can make a lot of money off of solar power, not just oil. And I think it's a good thing that the UN has also brought in private sector companies into their fold. I mean, I think they finally realized, okay, you can't keep demonizing them because there is money in the private sector and it can be mobilized in a different way than at the international level or at the national or even local levels in these countries. There's a lot less red tape. It can happen quicker. And there's also more technology innovation taking place in the private sector than there is in the government. So I think to harness that, you really have to include them in this discussion. So, you know, and I think this recent drop in oil prices, I read somewhere that the actual barrel that the oil is held in is priced higher than the oil itself. So this all plays into, okay, well, there has to be a shift to renewable energy because that's where the money is. That's where the market is going. That's where the demand is. And so politically, you'll see a shift too, because obviously one follows the other. And I'm not, you know, I will leave it up to the economists to talk about whether the market follows politics or politics follows the market, but they are related, whether we want to, however you want to look at it, they're related.
Do you think the oil price drop could have been a subsequent, also like a ripple effect from the Paris Agreement? Because I read that coal price also went down as because of the Paris Agreement. So I was
wondering. You know, I think it's that that companies are anticipating government regulations. Maybe not in the States because lobbying is so prevalent here, but you know, I think I think they definitely want to prepare for the future. And what we have to remember is that none of this happens overnight, and these companies employ a lot of people. So they can't just retrain their entire staff overnight, and they can't lay them off because of the economic impact. It would be massive and disastrous. So I think that they're anticipating this, and so maybe it's like, okay, well, the market is fluctuating. It could also just be a blip on the radar, but I think it is sort of related to all this focus. And I don't, hopefully it doesn't have a negative impact on people's employment. But jobs training from governments is going to be necessary as well in renewable energy jobs and kind of this green growth that we keep talking about. And I think you'll see a lot more funding for startups that are focusing on energy efficiency and solar power and wind power and all these things. And it was interesting last year at the Lima COP, it was one of the first times that all the renewable energy sectors came together under one umbrella. And prior to that, they were really like at odds with each other for whatever reason. They were like, no, wind power is best. No, solar is best. But I think they finally realized, okay, you have to band together in order to get a push for whatever works regionally. I don't think that wind power is really going to work in a desert all the time, but solar will. But solar is not going to necessarily work in places like, Finland or Norway, but wind will. So it's, there's more of like a team effort, I guess, informally or formally sometimes. So there's going to be a lot of financial scaling up, I think, in renewables. So if we go to the next slide. I think somebody had asked me to talk about CSR just a bit. And I haven't done a lot of work in this area, but I will talk a little bit about it. People I've talked to who are CSR people at companies in New York and then elsewhere, they seem to have specialties. So somebody will focus on the environmental sustainability and somebody will focus on labor and, somebody else will focus on the community impact of a company in an emerging market. I think going forward, though, after Paris, because climate change has now become so cross-cutting, it has impacts in all these different areas, and I think people are starting to really see that. These CSR strategies within companies will be all-encompassing, and they'll have to be more holistic rather than in these silos. So, and you'll see, I think we use CSR and sustainability slightly differently. But within the private sector, I think it's going to start to merge a little more, especially with companies like Unilever and these huge manufacturing companies that do so many different types of products across so many different sectors. You can't really have these silos anymore because environmental impact is going to have an impact on the women in that community, and it's going to have an impact on child development and whatever else is going on where these factories are. And it may be more expensive to do it this way in the short term, but I think in the longer term, it's an easier sell for these executives because they can say, okay, well, we anticipate these government regulations coming down on like emissions or labor standards or whatever else. And again, maybe not in the States, but around the world for sure, where American companies are operating, it can be sold slightly easier as like, okay, well, if we get ahead of the curve, we're ahead of our competition, our products will sell better, et cetera, et cetera. So there is like a very business aspect to Paris that I don't think a lot of people have seen yet, but I think we will going forward. Let's go to the last slide. So carbon, obviously this is a big issue as well. Besides renewables, this is going to be a huge issue post-Paris. I think one of the things that Paris didn't do, which I didn't expect either, because I think it's just it's like finance, it's kind of a big question. Because you can't scale to renewable right away, you have to do something in the interim. And you'll see, I think Pedro talked about it a little bit, about like countries having a peaking year of emissions where, okay, we're going to keep emitting at our levels until this year, and then we anticipate being able to reduce. and reduce until we get to like a certain percentage of where we are right now, which is what the US and China agreed to November of last year. Or sorry, November of 2014. I think, yeah, especially in like India and China, this is going to be a big question. You know, I think that the environment minister in India had said right before Paris that they were talking about putting a higher price on their coal in order to, and using the profits from that to subsidize their solar energy efforts, which is not a bad idea, considering they still have to produce coal for their domestic energy needs. So it's, I don't think it's the worst idea. It's not great because you're still running on coal, but at the same time, it's probably a more realistic and feasible way of doing things. But there is this big debate on like, okay, if you do put a price on carbon and you end up having a marketplace for it, is it really helpful? Does at the end of the day, are you really reducing emissions? Because there's no guarantee that companies will use the profits from the sale of their carbon emissions or target allotments to go towards something that's more energy efficient. They could just be making a profit off of it, which is one of the arguments. So there's, you know, there are people in that camp that say, no, carbon pricing and carbon markets are absolutely necessary. This is what we have to do in order to scale. Other people are saying, well, you're not incentivizing companies not to emit so much, because you're basically giving them another way to make money off of it. So I don't have any answers to that, unfortunately, but that is something to think about. And I think the engineers on the call will have a better answer to that. And, you know, and you were talking a little bit about carbon capture solutions and stuff like that. The other part where this comes into to Paris is that, do you count any funding, any climate finance money towards carbon capture technology? Do you count any climate finance money towards setting up a carbon marketplace? I mean, yes, maybe it has a climate benefit, but is it clear enough to count that? And one example of this was Japan in 2014 decided to count funding a clean coal plant in Indonesia as part of their climate finance contributions. And of course, they got roasted for this, and it was like this big PR disaster for them, because what are you doing funding a coal plant? I mean, even if you say it's cleaner than what Indonesia would have built on their own, it's still a coal plant. So these are like some really big questions that are still remaining that private sector will definitely have to get involved in. So, yeah. So I think that sums it up on financial impact. Hopefully I covered most of the big issues, but yeah.
You added so much.
Yeah.
And I'm very sure that everybody will agree that we learned a lot from you.
Oh, good.
No, because, you know, we hear, I mean, we can, especially you, since you're involved in this and you're at the UN right now. I mean, what we get by being at our universities is really just one side of the whole picture.
Yeah. And I think it all starts with this academic research, though. I mean, you have a lot of opportunities as students to do more cross-disciplinary research. I think med schools are going to get more involved, engineering departments for sure. So it's not just, you know, you can't operate in this silo anymore. I think professors are going to have to talk across departments, whether they like to or not. So
that is so funny that you're saying that, because that is something my university is also very pushing a lot for, especially my department in chemical environmental engineering. We are so full of introverted people that really just love research in our lab.
Yeah.
But really though, like, especially with for example, the California drought, climate change, there's so many aspects to, economy, politics. It's a very holistic issue. And you can't just, I think universities kind of have a fault in that too, is that you do major in a specific major, and that's a specialty. But at the same time, you need to have exposure to other aspects of the same problem that you're very passionate about. And I think that's very important. And I think, that's funny that you bring it up, because my professors, the whole university is saying, come on, guys, get out of your lab, go out and study some political case, or,
Yeah.
really,
And it's out of everyone's comfort zone. But I think if you, like, especially for people who are just in school now, I think most of you are probably grad students, but if you're not, and you're going out for jobs or whatever it is, like, this is important, because nothing is really black and white anymore. Everything is related, and this climate is like, prime example of all of that. So,
especially with climate,
Yeah.
And as you were saying with carbon, as I was reading all through the research, and I was reading about the stranded assets, and about how you were saying some countries were saying we're gonna peak our emissions by, I think China is 2030.
Yeah.
And I know China, I think a region of China, I'm not exactly sure where, but I know they subsidize coal. And you were saying bringing in the private sector would really make a difference in all these countries. So I think, just the whole thing that the UN really realized the private sector is really important, and private sector really needs to be emphasized in all these countries. And they're also,
and I don't want to make it seem like, oh, poor private sector, like they've been demonized. Like, it is their fault that this is happening, like, in part.
of course.
So we might as well bring them in and hold them accountable for things as well. Because
it's also it's a political strategy, because it happens to be that in the private sector, people that work for the private sector tend to be a lot more conservative, and they're usually the ones that don't believe in climate change. But by providing economical, opportunities for them to grow their business, it's awesome. And it really does, because that's what they care. A lot of people just care about money, and when they give them opportunities to make more money, they get excited about it, and then they change their views. And so I think it's a very great tactic that they're using.
Yeah. And I think, even, like, I would say with startup culture now, the fact that, like, you can go get venture capital funding for a startup on your own, you'll see a lot more people getting involved in this field, because they have the money to do it. And it's, obviously profit is still a major issue, but I would say if you're working on in a science or engineering field, or if you are working on environment issues, and try and make a business case for it, because that's really, even for governments. I mean, the U.S., you'll see, like, they don't want to do anything that's going to take away jobs. They don't want to do that. It would be a disaster politically, and that was I mean, it's an argument that's made by the conservatives a lot, but it's not a totally invalid one, I will say.
Of course. I think
so
the conservatives really do have a point, and I think this was part of why the Kyoto Protocol was such a failure. It's because it was Congress. It was Congress that didn't let it pass.
Yeah.
And you can see the economical.
Yeah. And it's, it'll be interesting to see what happens this year with the election. I mean, I have, obviously I think we all have a preference on who we want to win, but, for the sake of believing in climate change and all that, but it will be interesting to see what happens. Hopefully it'll turn out okay.
So I have a question, and I know that you have to go. So before
Oh, no, it's okay. Yeah.
I'm also going to open for questions for other people to ask you as well. But
Sure.
I'll start with the first question. Is that, do you know, I'm going to talk about it later, so people might be confused about this now. But as you were saying, the Paris Agreement is not a legally binding document yet, because the parties have to ratify it starting in April. Do you know, or do you think that the U.S. election could play a major role if the U.S. doesn't ratify it before the elections? Does that make sense? Because I know the elections are not, I mean, I think they open their ratification process before the elections, but I don't know if they're going to ratify it right away, or if they're going to wait until after the elections.
Yeah. I mean, there are journalists who are experts at this that work on Capitol Hill and cover this pretty regularly. And I can definitely give you, send out links to people's stories on this who are far better versed than I am, because I usually cover the UN aspect of it. But I will say, yeah, this whole, I was talking about it at the very beginning in case no one caught it. There was this big push at the, like, they announced that they were going to sign the Paris deal, and then there was like this hour and a half wait while everyone was sitting in the room. And the problem was that the US wanted a one word change that would change a lot of the legal implications of the Paris Agreement. And it was like the difference between should and shall in one of the clauses. And it sounds so petty, but it actually, it has a lot of impact on how, like, when the president can sign it, and how, you know, what parts he has to go through Congress and what doesn't, because it may result in a regulation change and it may not. So if this will come up, I think, after the election, you know, he has like a month and a half before he leaves office where maybe something will actually happen. I mean, usually nothing, you know, a lot of smaller things get passed during that point, because it's a lame duck. He's a lame duck president at that point. But this is big enough that I don't know that that will happen. But I will definitely look for some resources on that and get a better answer for you. But it will have an impact, I think.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. If you do know, because that was something, as I was reading about the Kyoto Protocol and about, you know, how the whole ratification process, I was like, oh my gosh, they have US elections this year. What if it doesn't get ratified, and then the whole fiasco happened, and then
Yeah. And then there, you know, there was also like this very, I mean, Obama was dealt a blow during this whole carbon trade fiasco that happened in Congress early in his first term. They lost that fight, and so it's kind of an uphill battle to get this. But you know, it was interesting to see, like, a lot of representatives and senators came to Paris that were hosted by the U.S. delegation to be there and to really understand what the agreement is. I mean, obviously they see hundreds of pieces of legislation, so this might just, you know, to really understand what the impact of this is and to understand that the regulatory impact on it. So that was good. I mean, at least people actually can grasp the legality of it, that are fighting for it on the Hill. So we'll see. I mean, I think it really depends on who comes into office. But, you know, I'm happy to see that climate change is being talked about in these debates, but they don't get down to the details so much. It's still in the US on that plane of, like, does it exist or not? And we have to move past that discussion. You know.
It blows my mind.
Yeah.
That is great, because, you know, coming from a science field, it really just,
yeah.
Very cool. Well, if anybody has questions for Mithley, I'll open whoever wants to ask. I know she has to go shortly, so feel free to ask her now. And Reina, I believe if people want to talk, you have to unmute them.
Yes, I believe that is correct. So if you would like to talk, please, actually that's not true. You can also unmute yourself. It's on the bottom left of your screen. There's a little microphone that says mute. You can just touch that and it will unmute you. So feel free to do it yourself, or if you're having trouble, just send me a chat and I can unmute you.
Anybody? Question? No?
Sorry, I went through a lot and it was a little.
No, you did a great job. You taught us a lot.
But, you know, if anyone has questions, you feel free to email me. I mean, I may not be able to answer it, but I'll certainly point you in the right direction. And like I said, there are reporters who've been covering this for years that are very specialized in certain aspects of it. But finance, I can answer probably.
Email. Could you share your email with everybody? I don't know. Where's the chat?
Yeah, I will actually. If I respond to that email list, maybe that would help.
No, there is a chat. I mean, you can do that, or you can just
oh yeah,
on the chat.
Okay.
I don't
Let's
even
see.
know what the chat is in this thing. I'm still getting used to this Zoom.
Yeah. I'm not sure where the chat is, but Reina, if you,
Yes, yes. So the chat is at the bottom. There's something that says chat, and there's currently there are some little dots on it. But also we can just follow up and talk about your email, and I can share it with everybody. But
yeah,
before you disappear, though, Julia, it looked like you had a question.
Yes, yes, I do. I was just taking notes while you were talking, and you had mentioned that agriculture is kind of the main reason that people are going from the rural areas into the urban areas, and that's creating a lot of conflict, kind of like what happened in the late I want to say 1600s, when everybody started, moving into the cities, and they were starting to build the sewer systems and all the different things, kind of before the Black Plague came along. But now we're doing a climate version of that. So do you think that because so many big industrial companies have taken a large portion of the agricultural market, do you think that any of the governments that were at the Paris Agreement, or that were at the meeting, or any of the other groups that want to make an influence, do you think they would put a lot more pressure with the country's kind of, I want to say, political and congressional influence? Do you think they would put a lot of pressure on those companies, private companies, in order to either put more money into this particular project and fund for the $100 billion that they need to raise? Or do you believe that they will kind of influence them in another way? So how do you think they're going to influence this agriculture focus?
I think, well, it's hard to say, but I think you really, for any aspect of this, you're going to have to make the business case for them. Like, how are they going to profit from not taking up agricultural land? How are they going to profit from having people live in rural areas rather than urban? I think part of the problem is, like, at least in India, it was after the tsunami in 2004, 2005, a lot of fishing villages were wiped out. And so all those people ended up moving into the cities. So that's not necessarily related to a company coming in and taking their land. It's just, it was a climate disaster.
Right.
But I think for companies that are going into these emerging markets, or like these least developed countries, they are going in because they have done a profitability study and they know that they can make a profit on something there. So I think it's just a matter of making a study or making a case for them. They can continue to profit, but also be more environmentally friendly, more climate friendly. I'm not sure who would do that. I think it will have to be internal mostly. So it's really getting a buy-in from CSR people and from executives. But there is a case to be made for that, and it just depends on the company and depends on their product and what they're doing. And it could be more expensive in the short run, but trying to account for these things in the long run is what's important. But yeah, I think host countries too, like, it's hard, if you're going into Laos and they're a least developed country, they won't turn away somebody who's going to give them jobs and money. So it's sort of getting them so that's where this climate finance money comes in, this 100 billion, so that they do have a choice to say no, or they do have a choice to put conditions for these companies to enter. Because right now they don't. They have, it's either give my people money for food and shelter and water and whatever else, or protect the environment, which they won't be able to enjoy because they'll leave or die. I mean, it's a very black and white way of saying it, but that climate finance mobilization is what it's really to give them a choice to put regulations in place. So it comes from both sides. I don't know if that really answers your question. Hopefully it does.
No, it does. It does. Thank you. It just gives a different perspective on all of the kind of the general picture of the issue. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not just for the companies to take. It's not on them necessarily completely. You know, it is for a country like Laos to say, well, no, if you come in here, I don't want you to ruin our delta. I don't want you to take over these fields. You know, but they don't. Economically, they don't have the option to do it right now. Like they need the investment. They need the financial incentives that come with it. So
That makes sense. Thank you.
all right.
Anybody else? Right, doesn't seem like it. Nobody wait. Well,
Okay.
you're more than welcome to stay for the rest. There's a lot that we're gonna cover. We still have a bit. So you're more than welcome to stay. Whenever you have to go, you can go.
I may just jump off and sign back in because my phone battery is dying, so I'll replace it.
You know how to get back in. Just click on the link for Zoom and.
Okay.
Yeah, but thank you very much.
No problem.
And
I'll try and jump back on, so in case anyone has any questions or whatever. So okay.
Thank you so much. This was really, really interesting, and I'll be sure to follow up with your email address.
Yeah, and feel free to email me with anything you guys have. You know, like I said, I may not be able to answer it, but I'll try, and I can definitely point you in the right direction. So.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
So going back to the other PowerPoint. Somebody there you go. I think it was you, Sam. All right. Going back to that PowerPoint. All right, so we're gonna keep going. Technically, it's part of the finance, but I guess it'll be more the mechanisms on how they are going to make sure that people are doing the right thing and they're taking the right steps towards climate change, not prevention, but fixing of what has been done. So there's two different mechanisms that the nations can use to check or assess their emission reductions. And these two are stock take and ratcheting. They're kind of similar, and I was a little confused when I was reading about them because I'm an engineer, I'm not an expert in international politics, but thought it was quite interesting. So stock taking is when countries announce how they've reduced carbon emissions every 5 years. And the agreement provides the Paris Agreement provides a timetable for the countries to take stock of their emissions reduction commitments and make additional, more ambiguous pledges. Ratchet mechanism or ratcheting is when countries announce more ambitious emission reductions. And this is different than the stock taking because the time changes for each country. For example, India is every 5 years, and the US or Pacific Islands is every 5 years. It is a mechanism that asks most governments, except those in very undeveloped countries, to strengthen their policy instruments to reassess commitments. And this is written in Article 14, sections 1, 2, and 3. Again, I'm not gonna read them, but I recommend you do because it's very interesting how the word, as Mithy was saying, the wording is very specific and it really describes this stock taking and ratcheting to a very specific way. So I recommend you do it. And then Article 14, item 20 is, as she was saying in 2018, is a felicitative dialogue, which is not a stock taking, but it'll get people talking, and this should be done in 2018. The actual stock taking that is written in the agreement is going to happen. Do I have it on here? I don't have it on here. Yeah, it says it up there in 2030. So 2018, they'll meet again to dialogue on what they've done to prevent emissions, and then in 2030, it is the official package that we're looking for. So who is making sure that people or countries are doing what they should be doing to reduce emissions that cause climate change? And this is very interesting when I was reading different countries' perspective on it. And apparently the US wanted to hire an outside agency to make sure that all the nations keep their promises that they made during the Paris talks. But interestingly enough, not everybody was a big fan of that. And they were kind of skeptical, especially with China and India, because, and I can tell why they did that. It's because, you know, they're still in the process of developing and making a commitment, having such a, I wouldn't say third world country, but such a second world nation is a bit hard to commit. And, you know, that didn't get passed, unfortunately. So no third party was hired. But the nations are subject to a common framework of transparency. And through it, you know, they recognize that developing countries may need more help in reaching their goals. So basically, in the agreement, it says that all nations have to be transparent with how much they emit. And through that transparency, developed countries can help developing countries reach their goals. And now we move over to damage, loss, and responsibility. And this is also another beast other than finance, is because there's a lot of damage that already has been done. I mean, they're shooting for 2 degrees Celsius, but 2 degrees Celsius is already 2 degrees Celsius. So it is warmer than it is now. So who is responsible for the loss and the damage caused by climate change? And in 2013, the UN Climate Conference began establishing an international loss and damage mechanism to address concerns. And that mechanism is that the US and other developing countries, that is a typo, it is not developing, it is developed countries, which after all have emitted most of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere right now, they are responsible for the warming. So as Mithy was saying, in Copenhagen, Hillary Clinton and the Supreme Court promised that they were going to help developing countries, they were going to pay for the damages, for the floods, the droughts, and everything that was caused by climate change. But as we were talking about earlier, this is going to be very complex, as it is very difficult to prove that something is caused by climate change. And that's why the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is there, is to provide scientific evidence that, you know, certain events are caused by climate change, and therefore developing countries that cannot afford to fix those damages can get paid. There's a lot of scientific law involved, which I think is very interesting. Article 8 addresses loss and damage as climate vulnerable countries wanted. Obviously, they would push for it. And in item 52, it says that's where they recognize that developing countries need that funding for the loss and damage. Okay. And then for now, as in the present, who bears the responsibility for protecting the climate? And obviously, everybody has a role to play in keeping the world safe, but highly developed countries have the most responsibility. So they don't have just the responsibility to pay for the damage that have already been caused. They also have the highest responsibility now and in the future. All nations exist under the same transparent reporting, as I was saying, but there's a differentiation on how the transparency will occur. Obviously, you know, developing countries struggle more, and they are the ones that emit the less. So obviously, they're allowed a bit less transparency than, let's say, China and the US, which are the largest emitters. It caused some frictions during the talks, particularly between the US and other countries, obviously, which was against any language that could establish a system in which the country could be held legally liable for climate change related damages. And this is what Mithila was saying, that shall and should. The US was really specific with the wording on this agreement because they don't want to be legally liable for specific things that they don't want to be liable for. So all finances are actually, for those that missed it, all finances are made in a decision, which is not a legally binding document. It is not written in the agreement. And it is because, you know, money really has a lot of complexities surrounding it. China is taking on cap and trade before the US has taken on a nation. I thought that was very interesting, given that the US is considered a very developed country. And India is planning to roll out 100 gigawatts of solar energy, an amount that will dwarf that of the United States. So you can see these countries that are economically in a worse situation than the United States, they're really taking big steps to reduce their emissions. So why is the US not doing more? And this is, this is the frustration that a lot of people living in the United States here we have, is that we have a Congress that's not really demonstrating leadership on the issue. Congressional Republicans doubt the reality of climate change, and Congress needs to step in and take greater leadership on this. This is from one of the interviewees that I quoted. I think she was in the Mashable. I have the references at the end if you guys would like to read the whole interview. Interestingly enough, she said, otherwise, if the U.S. doesn't get, if the U.S. Congress doesn't take a role on this, the nations that are developing will. And I don't think the US should let that happen. Also, there was a lot of conversation on price on carbon, but it's not yet getting there. I remember going to a talk in San Diego where they were talking about a carbon tax that they wanted to put on China. But again, when it comes to money, things get very difficult, and there's a very large gray area that people can go through. So there's no legally binding document that says this. As I said, China will put a cap and trade. The US Clean Power Plan is being implemented in most states, but not in all states. And this is considered a cap and trade mechanism. And developed countries will help fund long-term low carbon growth plans of developing countries through the Global Green Growth Institute. Also, a number of billionaires announced a global collaboration to drive innovation of energy, which is awesome. This is the private sector, which Mithili was saying. This is one of the very few times that private sector is actually involved in UN conferences, which is a great thing. And it said the mission innovation will double that of government clean energy research and development, and Breakthrough Energy Coalition, 26 billionaires committing to invest to help commercialize new ideas. And as she was saying with the oil, right after the Paris Agreement, stock markets pushed the prices of publicly traded coal companies down and renewable energies companies up, just as an effort to, show people that coal and oil are going away versus the renewable energy is where people should invest. And these are the stranded assets that we talked about before. As coal and oil go away, there's a lot of stranded assets that really do need some consideration because they're still there. So after Paris Agreement, there's a significant amount of international climate finance available for at least developed countries. And the Green Climate Fund and from other institutions will be the ones that will be providing this. And just as a city that is close to me, I thought it was very cool that the city of San Diego committed to be 100% renewable energy by 2035. So cities do have local efforts. So it's not just at the national level, which I think is very cool. And I think most cities should have a plan because, in a nation, there is states, inside states, there's cities. So by taking actions at the personal and local level, it is, we can make the nation be a lot better in a better track. So this is the cool part, I think, of the whole thing, the reflection of COP21. So, sorry, somebody is not muted and I'm hearing myself.
I think it's because we just had someone join us on the phone.
Oh, okay, can you mute them or no?
So Okay, I'm putting myself back up so it's not creepy.
No worries.
So I see that there's a phone number 858-405-1853. I don't know who that is, but if you wouldn't mind putting yourself on mute when you're not speaking, just so that we don't hear the background noise, that would be great. I don't think I can mute them, so since they're just on the phone, but I'll see what I can do. Okay, thanks, Pedro.
Yeah, no worries. So, okay, reflection on the summit. We'll just go first with what was not, ideal about the agreement, and also what was really determined and what the Paris Agreement really means. So, global shipping and aviation industries did not really set ambitious goals towards decarbonizing their business, and it didn't make it. That didn't make it into the agreement, and this is really important. And I can tell you this because in my research center, we do study a lot of shipping and aviation emissions, and they're really large. In fact, for example, the Port of Long Beach here in Los Angeles is the largest emitter in the whole LA basin, and I believe in the state of California. So it is really sucky that shipping and aviation didn't make it into the agreement because they're really, really, really large carbon emitters. And the carbon war room, I read about them in the article that I was reading, which apparently they're an international non-governmental organization, an NGO, that work on issues regarding market-based solutions to climate change. So this is kind of an incentive to end carbon, but also still create jobs, which is what we talked about. Usually the conservatives, people that don't believe in climate change, don't believe in it because they think that they're gonna steal the jobs away, and they're gonna, the economy is gonna collapse if all the oil industries are gonna go away. So NGOs like the Carbon War Room is really necessary in this whole process because people still need to see that there is an economical, there's economical opportunities in business relating to green energy. So I think they're green. More NGOs like that are very necessary. So at COP21, countries agreed to the agreement. And I was very shocked when I was reading about this, that the agreement is actually not legally binding. So does the agreement mean, so does this mean that the agreement is now in effect? And actually, no. What they did, it was a big triumph because they actually got the people together to talk about it, and they actually wrote the draft while they were there. However, no country is legally binding, or this document is not legally binding any country. So technically, nothing really got accomplished. So, no, a lot got accomplished. Let me rephrase that, but not enough for to fight climate change. So what occurred was an adoption, and countries still need to take steps to make it into effect. So what needs to happen now? Countries must become a party of the Paris Agreement in order for the agreement to be legally binding. And only after at least 55 parties of the UNFCCC, representing at least 55% of total global greenhouse gases, sign on and indicate that they consent to be bound with the Paris Agreement, will the agreement actually enter into force? So what does that mean exactly? That's a lot of numbers, that's a lot of words. In April 22nd of this year, they will open the signing they will open the UN for countries to come in and to ratify the agreement, and they will have it open for a whole year. And experts expect many countries to attend. However, the reason why the Kyoto Protocol failed is because the US never got it passed through Congress, and Russia also never ended up signing it either until way later. And then once Russia signed it, then the US signed it. So what does this mean? Is that it could actually take a long time until the Paris Agreement actually takes effect. Joining the Paris Agreement follows a two-step process. Countries sign the agreement, and then they also indicate their consent to join and be bound to the parties. So as you can see here, there's a timeline. And if they don't sign it by April 21st, 2017, does that mean that the agreement will not take into effect? And I will talk about that later. So how do countries indicate their consent to be bound and become parties? Most countries will sign the agreement subject to ratification, acceptance, and approval, making their signature conditional and obtaining the required domestic approval for joining the agreement. And it will be very different for each country. National legislation is usually different in each country. For example, in Australia, the only requirement is formal notification and introduction of the agreement in Parliament. But for example, in Mexico, the consent of the Senate is required. In the US, many international agreements are joined as executive agreements based on presidential authority. So each country signs this agreement completely different. Each country works in a completely different way, which makes the process very complex. So some people think that 1 year is not enough for the agreement to be open. And as I was telling you guys before, can parties still join the Paris Agreement after April 22nd, 2017, if they didn't sign it before then? And the answer is yes, which is good because 1 year is not long enough. And the way they can do this is through a session. And a session is the term for when a country becomes a party to an international agreement that other countries have already signed in. So technically, yes, they can still approve it. But until then, until 55 parties that emit 55% of the greenhouse gases or more have signed it, it will not actually come into effect, and there will not be a legally binding stress, or I guess the countries will not be liable for anything until this is completely taking place. So there is several combinations. People study this and they see how this could actually happen. And right here, I show 3 different combinations that different countries can sign to attain that 55% threshold. If you guys want to look more or learn more about it, you can go to the World Resources Institute, and they explain, all the details. But I'm not going to go too much into detail because there's a lot. So taking the action needed to bring the Paris Agreement into force is an essential next step for countries to build on the momentum for COP21. And at the end of the day, it takes more than a commitment to control climate change. What they did in Paris was a commitment. Yes, they talked about it. Yes, once they ratify their agreement, they will take more commitment. Yes, but at the end of the day, it takes action. And these are my references. And if you have any questions, you can email me. Or if you guys have any questions from Ethili, you can email me as well, and then I can forward it to her as well. And that's it. And I'll open it for questions before we have the other speakers speak.
And once again, if you do have a question, feel free to either unmute yourself or just chat me and I can unmute you.
And also, if I know I went through the slides quite fast because it does have a lot, of context, and there's a lot of reading to involve in the whole thing. I can send you the document. I sent the PowerPoint to everybody, but if you would like more details on on my references and all the pieces of it, I can just let me know and I can give you more resources. And I'm also not an expert at this. I'm a chemical engineer, so I'm also learning about this whole Paris Agreement thing, which I think is very interesting. Because I'll just open for discussion by asking you guys this: when you watched it on TV, and when you saw people signing they said, the agreement has been adopted, did you think, oh wow, yes, this is what we want, this is the end of it, this is what we were all waiting for? Did you guys know that there was going to be a lot more complexity after this? and there is actually a possibility of it failing?
Probably not, honestly, because everybody has their own opinion and everybody has their own agenda, and governments especially, they each want to get their own thing done. So unlike like a corporation or a company, you don't really know what their intentions are, for a particular time. So no, it wasn't a magical,
Right.
solution for everybody to agree on. So everybody had to have some sort of benefit. And there's usually some sort of time that everybody needs, to go through all the different parties or all the different departments or all the different sections that need to make that change possible. So.
Yeah, I will say, I don't think, this is Maithili again. I think the feeling in the room when they signed it was that it was already a success. So you can only really go up from here. The fact that they even came to this agreement and didn't go so overtime in Paris was pretty shocking to everyone, but I'm pretty sure it had to do with the foreign minister of France, Laurent Fabius. He really pushed parties to come to the agreement on time and make it something that, yeah, maybe not everyone was incredibly happy about, but no one was so unhappy that they opposed it. So I think it had enough for people to sign on, to be on board with it. So I think they all felt like, okay, we did something good. Let's keep it going. The world doesn't think we're a bunch of failures, which was, they were really worried about being completely embarrassing to themselves. But the fact that they weren't was a big deal. So.
No, of course, and I think it was a complete success. Like there was we were mentioning at the beginning, it was really great that they met up in Paris. And think about it, 195 countries. Like that's so many people with so many different languages. But it honestly really was a success. I was just very shocked to hear that, this is kind of what happened with the Kyoto Protocol, and the US didn't get it past Congress, and it was just because of the US, Kyoto Protocol failed. So it kind of makes me nervous after reading the whole thing and reading the background of what happened in the past, that there could be a chance. I'm not saying that we're in the same situation as during the Kyoto Protocol, because I feel people have really gotten educated about climate change, and there's a lot more talk about it now than there used to be back then. But it's still scary, of what could happen, especially having the US elections this year. So anybody else would like to add? We have a couple more speakers who are going to talk about, I guess it's still related, right? Yeah, Yati, are you there? Oh, you're going to have to unmute yourself.
Yes, I just unmuted it. It's somewhat related. We're talking about situational management.
Right. So if nobody else has any questions, I can you guys take over. Do you guys need me to bring out the slides?
That would be wonderful if you could.
And would you like to also offer a little bit of context for how you came to this moment for those of us?
Yes, of course.
Sure.
Yes. Also, introduce yourself, where you come from, where you are, all of that, please.
So I'm Jayati, and I'm a junior at Columbia, and I'm with the Millennium Campus Network Fellowship, and I'll be presenting on situational management with Lizette. Lizette, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Lizette. I'm also a junior at Columbia, also part of the Millennium Campus Network Fellowship. So, yeah.
Awesome. So let me pull up your slides.
And can I just add something while you are pulling up slides? So thank you so much, Jayadi and Lizette, for doing this presentation. I just wanted to add that the Millennium Fellowship is an 8-month fellowship for students who are leading campus-based organizations working towards one or more of the SDGs in some capacity. And as part of that year-long commitment. They are leading best practice sessions that are reflective of some of the content that they've been learning in the fellowship. So I'm really excited to hear your situational management session, but I just wanted to offer a little bit of context for those of you who aren't familiar.
Very good. So I think with no further ado, I'll just open the slide. Let me know if you can see it. And I'm sorry, but you're gonna have to tell me change or.
Yeah, that should be fine. There's only 3, so.
Okay, cool. All right, let me open it.
Pedro, you'll have to share your screen again.
Yes, correct.
Okay, just noting it.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome. So you can get started. I mean, you already had the introduction, so I'm guessing I'll go to the first slide.
Yeah, so this is the leadership model for the situational management. You'll find that when you're leading an organization or a group, your members or your board members will probably like fall into one of these 4 categories. If their directive behavior is low and their supportive behavior is also low, then you'll find that person will fall into the delegating square, and you'll need to like direct them a lot more and support them and give them a lot of more motivation to like do their job. If they fall on the low spectrum of the directive behavior, but on the high spectrum of the supportive behavior, they're on in the supporting square. So, you know, they have a lot of support, but they need a little more motivation, a little bit more direction as to like what they're doing in their role and stuff like that. Yeah.
Awesome. So Lizette kind of talked about people who are currently have low skills or maybe haven't learned about their role as much. I'm going to talk about the 2 categories of people who have developed those skills. So if they have those skills but aren't as motivated, then they'll fall into I think I mixed that up. If they do not have skills, but they are motivated, then they'll fall into the directing category, in which case they'll need someone to teach them to use those skills, but they're very excited about the work that you're doing, so you want to keep them motivated. And then if they have those skills and they also are motivated, then they're in a very good place, and what they need is more of a coach to offer them feedback and to help them refine their skills, but really they're in a good place to work with you in whatever you're doing. And with that, we're going to move on to the next slide, please.
Yes.
Yeah. So the first step to avoiding conflicts is preparing yourself. So some steps that you can do to avoid conflicts later on in your organization is to understand the working styles of all the people in your group, to set goals for the group and each individual in the group, and to define delegation and communication channels. So like who tells who what to do and who is supposed to communicate what about their role to whoever. So yeah. You can move on to the next slide.
Okay, so as much as you can do to prepare to minimize conflict, there is always going to be conflict in an organization. And with our hub site sessions, we've kind of identified 3 key steps to managing that conflict. So one of those things is you need to understand what happened, what the situation is. If it's an interpersonal conflict, then talk to the people who are upset. If it's something external, then get all the facts. And with that, you'll be able to move forward. So once you have that information, you want to focus on the action needed to resolve that conflict. And it's easy to get caught up in why it happened or maybe whose fault it is, but that's not very productive if you're in a conflict setting and you want to focus on resolving it so you can move forward. And that doesn't mean be hasty and do something that may be dangerous in the long term, but that means, focus on the concrete steps to resolve it. And then once it's resolved, then you can analyze what happened, so it doesn't happen in the future, or there's improvement in the structure, whether that be the stuff we talked about earlier, like clearer delegation or communication channels, or if it was a new situation that comes up, you can work that into your framework. But yeah, to summarize, you want to understand the conflict and then focus on resolving it. And then once it's resolved or it's on its way to being resolved, don't forget what happened and figure out why it happens, you can be improved for the future. That's pretty much it from us. Any questions?
I think what you guys shared could also be used in politics, right? You know, to resolve conflicts and management of conflict. I think it's very applicable, really. And as we were talking about, you know, climate and how climate affects conflicts, and coming back, as you were saying, focus on understand the conflict. Why did the conflict happen? I mean, we kind of are in a war, but you know, the price of wheat was very high because we didn't have wheat because we were in a drought. You know, understanding that conflict is really important. So yeah, I think it's applicable not just for management in the workplace, but for I wish politicians got this, honestly. So very good. Any other questions from anybody? Yes, no. Well, thank you very much for presenting. That was awesome.
Okay, thank you as well for hosting this.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting us to your session.
Of course. Hope that you guys, you know, got some information about COP21. I think it's important. And at the end of the day, what I'd like to share is, you know, as a final, I guess, closing remark, is that, you know, we can't wait on politicians and on the UN to take steps to help climate or to, you know, reduce climate risks. I think really what's most important more than anything is on the individual and on the different life habits. Instead of driving everywhere like I do, you could ride your bike. Instead of, you know, wasting so much, don't waste, you know, be more strategic about what you buy at the supermarket, and waste less. And I really think it's climate change, even though it is really large in politics, it really comes down to the individual. And just like the city of San Diego did with their own city, our own cities can do it. And we need to push our city, our mayor, our, you know, city representatives to make our cities better, and also in our own homes. I think, again, it all starts with our individual, with our home, with our neighborhood, with our cities, and so on. So even though this is very important that the UN did this and that all these members of states gathered and made decisions, at the end of the day, who's really going to make a difference is the people, and what we do on our daily lives. So yeah, that's it. And if Reina, if you have any other further remarks.
I just want to thank you all. I think, as usual, you all put in a lot of really useful work, and I learned a lot about certainly COP and also various climate-related issues, but also I appreciated learning through your situational management section. So thank you all for offering your insights and your perspectives and your expertise, and I hope that this is the beginning of many more conversations. I also hope that you saw that our guest speaker put her email address and Twitter handle in the chat. So feel free to email her if you'd like. And actually, for the purposes of the tape, perhaps I should say it out loud. So her email is mythili.s1@gmail.com. So if anyone's watching this on YouTube later, you can also email her. And thank you all for participating, and Pedro as well. Thank you.
Of course. Hope we all, you know, it's like it's unite. We can all make a difference, right? So yeah, thank you very much, everybody. And if you live in the East Coast, you can go ahead and go back to your cold, and I'll I go to the beach. Just kidding. It's too late to go to the beach. But hope that everyone had a great day. Has a great night, actually.
Have a good night, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.